You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. Last week, Brian Kelly kind of set the internet afire with his comments about NIL and whether or not LSU is going to buy players. Well, Wilson Alexander did what a good reporter would do, and that was dive deep into LSU's collective and the money and the NIL approach and all that sort of stuff. He's got a feature up right now over at The Advocate if you want to read it. But Wilson's good enough to join us right now. Perfect. How are you, dude?
I'm doing well. How are you guys this afternoon?
Doing awesome. Every time, I always find it interesting. When you start to write a feature story, you probably go in with some sort of preconception, and then throughout the process of doing interviews and gathering information, I think it either proves or disproves or alters that preconception. I'm curious what your thoughts were when you started working on this piece and what might have been confirmed or disconfirmed.
I had some, level of knowledge as to what LSU's collective financial situation was and LSU football's approach to sort of spending money on the roster and how it allocates funds in order to, build a roster because I've covered the team for the last few years. So in this case, you're right. Sometimes you do go in with, at the very least, just a reason for being interested, a curiosity of some kind. And you wonder why something is the way that it is. And there's always the last few years been, I think quite a bit of debate around LSU's NIL situation, and you've done some good, really good job sort of laying it out for people what's true and what's not. But it still felt like there was a lot of disconnect between fact and reality, and maybe especially after last week, with Kelly's comments and so many people seemingly taking those and running with them in a direction, especially just a little bit that was we don't buy players. It's LSU, look, everybody, LSU spends money on players. Everybody on the team is making money. And so what I guess I learned, so I already had some idea of all of that, but I guess what I learned in this was sort of really reaffirmed how they have improved over the past year to year and a half in a lot of ways. And they've widened and strengthened that donor base to become much more competitive. But that they still need to do a lot better, much better job of sort of crowd funding and sort of that grassroots nature and reaching those people. They are kind of well behind in that regard. And also operationally, they might need to continue to sort of fine tune this thing, and that it's going to be fascinating to see once it's allowed to move in-house what LSU does in particular. I think those conversations are still ongoing. But also I guess the other sort of takeaway for me was just that for this staff at this current moment anyway, guiding through Brian Kelly's philosophy, just NIL isn't the end all be all. And obviously they don't diminish its importance, but I thought it was interesting talking to him at one point a couple months ago about this, just how it is not the guiding principle for them in building a roster.
Do you, this is where I'm just going to ask you flat out an opinion, because I've been asked that question a lot about Brian Kelly's approach. And my thing is I don't know if that's a sustainable model. And I don't think any of us do, because we don't have a large enough sample yet of the NIL era to know. But what's your opinion, Wilson, based on what how LSU's approaching it and how other schools are approaching NIL? Is Brian Kelly's approach a sustainable way to compete for and win championships?
Well, I think this upcoming season and in 2025 as well is probably going to reveal that to us. After that, who knows exactly what the model is going to look like with revenue sharing on the horizon. Anyway, this could all be a very different kind of conversation. But we're going to find out here pretty soon if it is sustainable and if it can work, especially because of what we saw happen at defensive tackle. That was a very sort of public and clear, example of them sticking to their philosophy and things not working out in their direction. And so we're going to find out whether or not I think it can work. We've seen examples. I think there's other teams in the SEC. Alabama under Nick Saban was not known for spending copious amounts on NIL. He spoke a lot, kind of like Kelly does, about development and retention. The difference is, of course, that he'd had a long time to build up that roster before NIL was ever a factor. And then they also, they were still competitive under NIL. Georgia, similarly, I think has not been one of the top teams in terms of spending on NIL, but Kirby Smart has done a really good job of building up that roster over the last few years, and he was able to do that pre-NIL. But also, players who, and Alabama in particular, like come there just because they wanted to play for Saban, they wanted to develop and get to the league. And I think LSU is trying to kind of follow that blueprint of, really focus on bringing in the high school talent, developing that, and then something like I think that was emphasized by the folks I talked to for the story was then retain. That's going to be the big key. And I think to all this approach is, can they use the NIL money to retain those players and keep the roster together? Players are going to leave. That's the nature of the beast these days. But that's why whether or not it will work is if they're able to retain the top high school players they get, like in this 2025 class coming up. LSU is clearly doing something right with NIL to have a class that could be number one in the country. But once they get onto the roster 2-3 years from now, if they're still on the roster and LSU has all these guys like Bryce Underwood, then you know that this approach will probably be working at least at some level. I
mean, look at the last 2 years. I mean, you had a 5-star in Walker Howard, a 5-star in Lance Hurd, who were both here for a year and left. So that's not to say that's going to be what's common, but you see both sides of it. So it's a really good point. Wilson Alexander is with us. I wanted to address two things specifically. So Gordon McKernan sat in our studio and mentioned that LSU's roster a year ago, they spent $4 million on that roster. What I had been told this year is they were looking to push closer to 6 or 7. You report that they had budgeted $8 million for this year's roster. How, Wilson, as best you could tell, have they filled that gap from where they were just a year ago to now seemingly doubling their NIL budget?
They've been able to, certainly improve their donor base at a level at which, like, their top donors are giving maybe a little bit more. They're also getting from more people in the probably 10,000 to 1 million range, which is obviously extremely wide. But there's people actually giving, there's more people giving a little bit more substantial amount of money. The exact number of people, I don't know. But I was told that LSU's collective basically, by traditions, basically now has close to, but not quite yet, 1,000 members. And it's getting kind of close to that direction. That's kind of how, because over a year ago, they maybe had a couple hundred members. And they've been able to, certainly I think TAF has helped with that, from what I understand, being able to just sort of back Biotricians in some way and encourage people to go over there and donate. And so kind of give it some legitimacy. Whereas over the past couple of years or so, there was probably some confusion because they didn't do a great job of marketing, or getting their message out there as to what this was and sort of, breaking down some of those conceptions of NIL that people have that maybe make it scary. So they've been able to do that as well. But as I might have mentioned earlier, the thing that they haven't gotten to is that average fan, and they're going to have to be able to do that if they want to make this a little bit more sustainable. For people who are close to the collective, that's the thing that's frightening. Is there's some big money donors that have ponied up some funds here, but if something were to happen in their lives that is uncontrollable and they could no longer just afford to give money to this, then all of a sudden a major source of revenue is gone. So to strengthen it and make it more sustainable, they're going to have to be able to get to those people who can just give $25, $50 a month. But for, I think, a variety of reasons, they haven't been able to do that. And that's the next step for them to actually becoming maybe one of the top collectives. Because at this point, they're not. They've gotten a lot better, but they're still not at that upper echelon. Maybe they never will be because you don't have the money in a Texas and some of those major, extremely lucrative donors and a wide pool of them. But they could at least get to a point where they have more than they have at this point. So
it brings just a couple more things. And Wilson Alexander is our guest from The Advocate. Has a really good feature piece up right now at The Advocate on LSU's current NIL situation, their approach to building the roster with NIL. So you did reference reaching out to and engaging the wider fan base, right? The ones that aren't going to, the fans that aren't going to be able to give $10,000 to $100,000 or $1 million, as we referenced. And you alluded to a new sort of approach or campaign coming. What do we know about that?
Well, I was told that it's expected to launch as soon as expected to launch tomorrow. Actually, that this is something that LSU's been working on. It's gone through kind of a few different iterations, but they're going to be rolling out something that is encouraging fans to donate to Bayou Traditions, and that there were 2 anonymous donors who agreed to price match up to $2 million. And so, if LSU can get to that, all of a sudden you could have an extra $4 million in cash in the collective, and that's a lot of capital to work with. And that's, the collective funds teams across campus, not just football, although this article focuses on football. That's helpful for baseball, men's basketball, women's basketball, everything. And so that's kind of what we know right now. So I'll be really interested to see if that does in fact launch tomorrow as expected, or if there's some other kind of unexpected hang-up. But, if that initiative is successful, then it could, bring in a whole bunch of new membership and maybe, make this thing a little bit better. That's kind of the extent of what we know at the moment.
And what about structure as well? You mentioned potentially bringing the collective in-house. I'll be fascinated to see if that happens, what that does to change the structure of everybody's collective. Anything you can tell us? Best guess? What do you know?
Best guess is that TAF would be able to have certainly more involvement. I don't know if it would be under TAF, if it would be somebody else running it or anything like that, but that could help, because that's already where a lot of people know to go when they want to make donations. Overall, if they're able to bring it in house and have everything clicking, and not too many cooks in the kitchen necessarily, which we know sometimes people can run into. I think maybe in particular around here. Then you could have
my guy sliding in a little. Well, Jay's learned the Louisiana culture well. All right.
Well, that can sometimes be the reality and work to your detriment. So if you can have this thing streamlined and focused and working properly, then you have a situation where if it's working in house, then everything can be more streamlined and donations can be just a little bit more clarity for people. You break down some of that confusion about where do I go to for Bayou Traditions and all that stuff. Bayou Traditions might still have a role of some kind in all of this, even if it's in house. It's again, that part's just kind of unclear. The law, the NCAA has made this permissible, especially effective August 1st. But even then, LSU doesn't have this all sorted out at this point, because the law hasn't even gone into effect yet. It has to pass the Louisiana legislature first. I think that would be expected to happen. It's not a controversial bill or anything. It's really bringing them up into match what will be allowed by the NCAA. But once that happens, then LSU can begin to further move forward into just what all of that looks like. I think we're still a ways off from knowing really what that arrangement and setup would be.
He's Wilson Alexander. Y'all get him on Twitter at WHAlexander_, as we all like to say, at Whalesander_. Or at least maybe I just like to say. All right, Wilson, good work, man. Thanks as always for the time.
Thanks for having me, Matt. You have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.